actual stories of success were very messy, very sideways, very complex, filled with ups and downs, but the downs were not always conveyed. And what I found was so damaging was the belief that one is suffering in silence or alone when you're experiencing a setback or a negative experience in one's career, because we don't tend to discuss them. And I wanted to tell some of those stories really because I thought it's important that we know that whatever we do experience is generally not something we experience alone. It's been experienced before. And if someone can share a narrative, that will lead to improved resilience and improved survival skills to get through that setback.
Welcome to the Warriors at Work show. This is Jeannie Coomber, your guide and host. This is a show for men and women in the workplace who want to move from the predictable to the potent. This is your weekly dose of inspiration with an edge. I talk with CEOs and shamans, sports marketing executives and therapists. All of us are like-minded thinkers and doers who tell stories, share wisdom, and challenge each other to have the best life possible inside and outside the office. Welcome to your Warrior Conversation.
Hey everybody, it's Jeannie. Thank you so much for joining me here at Warriors at Work. Today I'm bringing to you a conversation with Aoifinn Devitt. And Aoifinn is smart, she's accomplished, she is very interested in the power of story and listening. She's also the Chief Global Market Strategist, but we didn't talk about her career. We talked about the power of story, the power of connecting on a human being level, and what happens when you share vulnerabilities and reveal more about yourself, how those insights can be huge learning and also a method of support for other people. So we also talked about Aoifinn's 50 Faces podcast that she put forward into the world during COVID, all with an intention of providing a platform for others to share their voices and to share their stories. And she's still going very strong with the podcast. But this is a beautiful conversation that really just talks about the power of connection, what happens when we listen, when we learn, and we take that into our careers from a leadership perspective. I hope that this is inspirational and something that you really enjoy. Aoifinn, thank you so much for joining me here at Warriors at Work. I've been looking forward to this conversation.
Delighted to be here. Thank you.
I always like to take a step back and start with the person before we get into anything specific. And you have such a fascinating background, and I want to share a little bit about it because talk about somebody who really has a deep interest in learning. So you grew up in Ireland, you started your financial services career in Goldman Sachs, you've held various chief investment officer positions, including the Policeman's Annuity and Benefit Fund of Chicago. Now you're Chief Global Market Strategist. In addition to your skills in financial services, you're a licensed attorney who's a member of the New York Bar. You received your law degrees from Trinity College Dublin, Oxford University, and an MBA from INSEAD in France, and an MSc in Applied Neuroscience from King's College in London. And then somehow you found the time to run 53 marathons and become fluent in French and German. When I read that in your bio, I was like, I think I got to step up some of the things that I'm doing outside of my career. So I would love for you to describe who Aoifinn is in your own words.
It's nice that you set that up like that, and thank you. I'd say I have always had an insatiable appetite for learning, and thinking about it in appetite terms, it is a bit gluttonous. In fact, sometimes I just want to consume more and more. I am very driven. I think it came from growing up in Ireland in the 70s. The mindset in the 70s in Ireland, it was not necessarily an economic prosperous time, was that we were working our way kind of into a different social status. So which usually meant out of the country initially for opportunities abroad. So I was very ambitious to move through the education system, move into the university degree, and then get a job overseas. And that has changed dramatically now in Ireland. But I would say the circumstances of one's upbringing are definitely important around that, as well as the family upbringing. Having uh, parents who were the first of their generation to go to college, and then them being very driven, them being very young when I was born. So they still had a lot of
Mm.
unfinished business on the education front themselves. Both of them pursued degrees, subsequent degrees, while we were children. So we saw that all around us. So I suppose that all contributes to my drive. And if anyone were to define me, or if I define myself, I would say I am very energetic, I'm very ambitious, very driven, and often take on a lot, as gluttons sometimes do. We sometimes
Mm.
overeat, and we don't always taste all of it. But I'd say that overall, very satisfied, and I haven't lost my appetite yet.
So when you were growing up, do you recall something that your parents said or did? Because obviously they were role modeling a lot for you as a child growing up. Do you recall that they did or said anything that really set the tone for you to go, yes, that's something that really resonates with me. That's something that I want to do something with.
The funny thing is, my parents were so young and so kind of getting on with their own career ambitions that we actually spent a lot of time with our grandparents. So it was more the grandparents that were setting the expectation, in the sense that my parents were busy fulfilling those expectations of their.
Mm.
So one thing I do remember is my grandfather, who himself did not go to college, but all of his children did, and they all achieved either first or second place in their college class. And that was just the expectation, that no matter where you were in the class, well, no matter what, should I say, no matter what level you were at, you were first in the class, first or second in the class. That was just the expectation. So that's a fairly lofty expectation, but that was just there in the background. So just that does definitely have an experience of osmosis that will be soaked up. So that was there. My parents were actually the opposite to helicopter parents, which I think probably led to some of my independence and resilience.
Mm. And you took so much of that drive and that ambitious, not only just in your career, but you leaned into this fascination and this love of story. By in COVID, you really felt compelled to do something powerful with it. So you started a podcast called 50 Faces, where you showcase stories of 50 people. That was the original intention. And now you've interviewed over 100 people in all walks of life, all levels of career. And it's all goes back to this sincere interest and understanding where somebody's coming from and in their story. So I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about the genesis of that idea and what that's been like for you.
One of the things I love is to get into the complexity of realities and situations,
Mm.
and to really go beyond heuristics, shortcuts, rules of thumb that present themselves in an overly simplistic way, so that people think that success is instant or overnight, or perhaps that certain people are just destined for success.
Mm.
And if you're not on that trajectory, it's too late for you. So what I saw through my career, because I started my career at age 21, so in a law firm environment, so I saw some fairly high performing professionals from day one, is that the actual stories of success were very messy, very sideways,
Mhm.
very complex, filled with ups and downs, but the downs were not always conveyed. And what I found was so damaging was the belief that one is suffering in silence or alone when you're experiencing a setback or a negative experience in one's career, because we don't tend to discuss them. So I had, by the time I started the podcast, had had a career of 25 years. I'd seen lots of ups and downs, lots of setbacks on my own. I'd seen other people's setbacks. I'd seen sideways movements and other movements that were perhaps not on that typical hockey stick trajectory that we all hear about. And I wanted to tell some of those stories, really because I thought it's important that we know that whatever we do experience is generally not something we experience alone. It's been experienced before. And if someone can share a narrative, that will lead to improved resilience and improved survival skills to get through that setback. And that
Mhm.
was something I learned about in families, that when families share narratives, say, of survival, of resilience, of overcoming hardship, whether that's through war, through a recession, depression, that all contributes to a family well-being, in that the younger generations believe they can be all equally resilient. So in a professional setting, I thought the same thing would apply. And I felt compelled to share stories that were real life stories of non-celebrity participants in our industry, being investments, to show that many people can get to successful positions in different ways, and equally that they probably have learned some lessons along the way. So that was motivation. I felt there were some stories that needed to be told. Many of these were stories of women, and women's stories, as we know, are not as often told or not as well amplified. That is, I think, a tale and a truism as old as time. So I
Mm.
particularly wanted to showcase women and other underrepresented voices in these 50 faces, not exclusively women, and that I wanted it to be a diverse set of faces. And that was the commitment device, to say I was going to do 50, and then I at least had to do 50.
And when you think about all of the people that you've had conversations with, where does your mind go when I ask the question, what was what was something that you really took from a conversation that you've really applied to your life or to your career? And then maybe there's a few moments that you would reflect on.
The first theme that really came out of these podcasts, which is actually something that nobody learns at school, is around the importance of networks. Because I think we learn the hard facts and the hard skills, but not always the soft skills. And even when I studied organizational behavior at business school, it was more around, power plays in organizations and different cultures in organizations, but not about the importance of actually cultivating your own network and cultivating that in a way that nourishes it and is not purely transactional in nature. I think that was the key thing that came out of this. The importance of relationships, the golden rule, treating others as you would like to be treated. These kind of very basic rules of human interaction that don't get reinforced enough, but that we often only see how important and relevant they are when things go badly wrong, such as in a financial
Yeah.
crisis, when you need others to have your back. So that was a theme that came out very much. Also, the power of vulnerability. I did start recording these during COVID, and vulnerability was, I think, at a high point then, and it actually intensified as I was recording them over the months,
Mhm.
because we were becoming more and more isolated, more and more disconnected from our realities, and the stress was starting to take a toll. So I built these beautiful relationships over Zoom, over purely in a virtual way, where I would ask deep, probing questions about people and their setbacks, their lives, and with a genuine interest, because I was genuinely curious in their answers and in hearing what they had to say. And that just remarkably opened up a great amount of wisdom and really a bond between us. So I'd say not being afraid of vulnerability. And then finally, just the importance of communication, really over communicating what you want to say and being very clear about it, and maybe not expecting others to have received it in necessarily a message simply because you said it once, and just learning that skill.
I love that you brought up vulnerability because, in my line of work, vulnerability is like the pathway to everything, really. It's getting beyond the title, beyond the external labels that are very often driven by external factors. It isn't necessarily something that we would call ourselves. And when you get beyond the surface of those things and beyond the packaging and you go to what are your real struggles? What are you really afraid of? What are the things that you're trying to accomplish or obstacles that you're trying to overcome in your life? That to me is like that's like the most beautiful part of being a human being. And if you have access to that, it can bring so much to your life that goes so far beyond your corporate role or title or function or responsibility. And I love that you bring that up because it's very often not discussed, especially in executive level discussions. But to me, it is like it is the secret sauce to everything to have access to it. So I love that you do that and that you did it so early on and brought that forward. I think the conversations that you hosted were so powerful and continue to be, which is something else I wanted to get into. Um, you you've also created different tracks, which I thought was really interesting. So different needs, like the next chapter, transitioning from senior executive to board seats and retirement, which that's a big, big transition for people. So I'd love for you to talk more about that. Where did that
Yes,
idea come from?
yeah, it's interesting. I suppose because I'm looking to the future, first of all, thinking about what many of my peers are doing in their next chapter of life. I hear a lot about ageism and it being perhaps the last acceptable form of discrimination. That clearly is, I speak about other underrepresented groups, but people who are older than a certain age are also an underrepresented group. And unfortunately, there are still a lot of biases and implicit and explicit in the workplace around that, particularly when it comes to women. There are fewer women being heard at a certain time of their lives. But overall, there is a sense that this is a less well heard group. And I also wanted to, there's no rule book as to how you
Mm.
transition into board roles. I think governance has never been more important. And each board member being educated, competent, confident, and with a voice and able to express it is essential to governance working. And because there's no set of really a guidebook for how to be a good director, I thought I would ask some of the best in the business, people I know have gathered a significant number of directorships, and ask them what it means to them to be a good director and chair. Because again, one of these things that is often the case is, are you chair ready? And it's hard to be
Mhm.
chair ready if you've never been a chair, but at least you can learn from some experts as to what makes a good chair. And that's in everyone's interest that governance be more efficient. It was also the people at this stage of the next chapter are also the ones, perhaps the greatest repositories of wisdom. So I really wanted to gather some of that there. So that was the origin of that series.
And so do you get ideas for different segments you want to cover just based on conversations, living your life, something comes up in conversation and you're like, "Ooh, that's interesting. Let me dive into that."
Absolutely. I see that there are many issues. We're all dealing with so many multiple issues in our lives and in the news flow that a lot of issues don't get sufficient attention. Or they get a little bit of attention, like, for example, LGBTQ rights around the month of June gets a lot of attention, but these are rights that need attention all year round. So we do
Mm.
have a Pride series. Granted, it is launched in the month of June, but we do also have bonus episodes throughout the year. And for example, another one would be maternal mortality. I do come
Hmm.
from a family of mostly doctors, so medicine has been in my blood for some time. And when it comes to representation in medicine, I think it suffers from many of the same problems that other professions suffer from, in the sense that there aren't as many visible minorities practicing medicine. That leads to lack of trust, perhaps, leads to lack of equal treatment. And a subject such as maternal mortality clearly disproportionately affects certain segments of the population. Maternal mortality is obviously key to women's health. Being a woman
Mhm.
myself, I can't divorce myself from women's health. And again, because there aren't as many women and as visible and as active, perhaps, as voices on the medical scene, this area does not get enough attention. We know that female health issues do not get as much research dollars. So these are areas, if I think something needs to be amplified, I will make a podcast about it. And could be something like ecocide, like the intersection perhaps of international law, human rights, environmental rights,
Hmm.
and other issues. That may not be a natural, my audience from the podcast may not be a natural audience for those segments, which is why I have the different tracks.
Hmm. And how has all of this helped you in your executive career? So, like, what's the connect point there?
Well, lots of areas it's helped in. First of all, it's made me a much better listener. And I'm sort of ashamed to say that it took me to my mid 40s to realize the importance of listening. But for sure, the gift that being a listener gives you is profound. Not only are you absorbing all of this wisdom, and in my case, many times over, like yourself, I edit podcasts, so I get to listen to the same wisdom, but 3 times by the time I'm done. So I get to absorb and internalize all of that. And taking that wisdom and internalizing it and having reference points for much of what I've gone through is excellent. It gives me that resilience that I'm seeking to endow upon others. And equally, a network, the network I have now with over 300 podcasts across the different channels is significant. And I consider each of these podcast guests to be true friends of mine now, because we have had this bonding experience. We've kept
Mm.
in touch. We've had that mutual benefit of me amplifying their voice, them helping me generate great content. So that's been a great network then to help to share with others.
I love that. And as a leader, when we were preparing for this, I know that you're a big proponent of self-improvement and coaching. And I love it when you said coaching pulls me out of the weeds and helps me to recognize things quicker. So what's been the big aha you've had recently in your own self-improvement and coaching that you'd want to share?
One of the things that's definitely been around communication is not taking, which is again, it's taken me to this long in my career to realize the importance. It's basically, and this I think there's probably more science now around communication, around neuroscience, around the levels at which we communicate, whether we have emotional bands that we're on at times, or we have a different bandwidth, perhaps that's the more practical bandwidth. So not assuming, and this is particularly the case when it comes to areas like having virtual interactions versus in-person interactions, the importance of knowing that a message has landed and circling back and affirming that that has landed. And also, I think, back to the vulnerability point, when it comes to communication, not to beat around the bush with the message, to be very clear that this is not a personal attack, but it may be a statement of a position, and to try to separate the two. And I think to be mature enough to separate a professional viewpoint with a personal side, and try to keep those two separate. Because I do think that conflict is very important in the workplace. And I mean that in terms of conflict of ideas, being able to challenge and to feel psychologically safe in that challenge, but equally to recognize that this is not a personal affront.
So do you work with a coach around your communication and how you're managing conflict?
I have worked with a coach. I think that it's hugely helpful. And I think that more people need to work with coaches at every stage of their career, because this to me is about taking ownership of your direction and not expecting other people to take ownership. I think that's one of the myths that it perpetuates in our career world, that you will have the sponsor that will handpick you, see you as someone with great potential, and will ensure that that path is laid for you and that you can walk along that path. I think that is a fantasy that we have to really pave our own paths. And once we take control of that with the help of a coach from early stages, I think it's important to see where you can get your coaching from. So I have worked with a coach at times. I have also taken coaching from many other sources at other times. I think one can get coaching from resources such as podcasts, such as self-improvement books, and just listening to leaders we admire and watching how they behave. That can be a great free form of coaching, essentially. But we always need to focus on that self-improvement, and I think investing in that. And I remember someone notably saying on a podcast, you would invest in the handbag. Why don't you invest in yourself? And I do think that that's kind of a meaningful thing. Why are we prepared to not invest in something which can pay so much in terms of return down the line?
You know what's so interesting about what you're saying? Obviously, as somebody that's been doing the coaching gig for about 19 years, one of the things that I think is very interesting, and this ties back to this work that you're doing around the podcast, is that everybody's operating in a system, and the system has a lot of assumptions. It has a lot of checks and balances that were predetermined by a previous entity or previous leadership structure. And anytime you decide that you want to pause and ask bigger questions, I think it frightens people to then mean to think that, oh no, I'm going to now challenge the system in which I'm operating. And what I want to highlight, and this really came out with a lot of the interviews that you were doing, is like the real growth is when we lean into wherever the tension is. And the real ahas that you will have, and you will live a more fulfilling and vibrant, multidimensional life when you're willing to look at the places that are outside the lines. And it's very much in the ethos of like your brand and how you operate. And I just wanted to call that out because it really resonates with me on how coaching, self-improvement, self-discovery, or even just a moment where like somebody might be listening to this right now and it's going to cause a pause to say, yeah, well, what system am I operating in? What are the things that I'm willing to reveal about myself? What are the bigger questions that I have? And if you're in an executive position, you are in a position of power to change the decisions within that system, which then could impact the system overall. Like, what are your thoughts or reactions to what I just said?
100%, I agree with what you're saying. And it actually, one of the themes you asked me earlier, some themes that come out of the podcast that have really stuck with me, is this idea of getting outside the comfort zone. And I interviewed a series of tech experts for a separate channel, separate stream. And there was a lot of discussion about pushing outside the comfort zone. And someone had said that's where the magic happens. And someone had countered, yes, it may be where the magic happens, but it's also where the terror happens. And I think those two things can coexist. And that complexity, the fact of these two realities coexisting, but that nonetheless, guest after guest is encouraging people, particularly young women, but any young professional, to push outside that comfort zone. And what do we do? I mean, it is the nature of being outside the comfort zone that there may not be a safety net. There may have to be the risk of failure. But another very much resounding theme is around the importance of failure and around how we frame failure and how we see failure as being an essential part of growth and an essential part of really just any new learning, is that there will be learnings within failure, and having to just focus on them and not being afraid of them. So I think it's by restating these concepts over and over again that we can provide that virtual safety net for other young professionals to push out of their comfort zone. The important thing to know is, just say they push out and it doesn't work out first time, that they're joining a club of other professionals who've had exactly the same experience but are still here, still thriving, and that's okay.
So true. So when you think about your own path, Aoifinn, what's next for you, and what specifically you're doing with 50 Faces too?
I think you probably would see this. There are some things that become bigger than you. And when you have a drive to just keep telling stories, you don't know, whether that will ever stop. This is certainly one of my creative forces, and the stories keep coming. The curiosity is still there for me. And as long as that's still there, I will keep telling these stories. I do think that combining them with this actual practical assistance, or the ability to link to people like yourself, to people who can actually let you take these stories and these experiences and convert them into a coaching program for yourself, that will be an essential next step. As well as really just letting people use this as a library of role models from which they can be inspired. There is a shortage of compelling role models. Maybe it's because I was recently at an art exhibition in Mexico City, and it was all the exhibits were by male artists. And I said to my daughters who were there, I said, does that bother you at all, that all these faces are male? And I think they hadn't thought about it. They were probably a little young, but I was thinking about it. So I'm hoping that for the next generation that we have a much more diverse set of role models that are there. And I'm hoping that this 50 Faces will be a way to showcase some of that. I'd also like to do more TV. I want to generate more original content, which is sometimes taking down sacred cows or discussing areas in the old-fashioned salon way, where there was a no-holds-barred discussion of topics that need to be aired, that perhaps because they aren't popular or they aren't winning clicks, that they perhaps don't get the airtime they deserve. So it's really try to ventilate some of these less well-aired issues. When it comes to career, I would love to take this further into developing this individualized service on the investment side, which is my core competency, and allowing people to express themselves through their investment, their values, their hopes, dreams, strengths, and their edge through their own investment portfolios.
Thank you for joining me for another episode of the Warriors at Work show. If you are interested in learning more about what we do at the Warriors at Work show and platform, be sure to go over to my website, Jeannie Coomber, and subscribe to my monthly Warrior Playbook newsletter. I share everything that I'm up to month by month, as well as some lessons and insights that I've learned. I'm also interested in hearing any feedback you have about this conversation or future topics. So reach out to me directly on jc@jeanniecoomber.com or on LinkedIn. Be sure to tell your friends and your colleagues about this Warriors at Work conversation. Subscribe, review, and rate us. It's the best way to get this message out into the world. Be well.